This meeting is titled, Why is Weather More Extreme? At first glimpse, it probably reads as a kind of topic for polite conversation. There's a British obsession with the weather. I don't know if you've picked up on that yet. Perhaps it's not surprising given our location. We're out here on the western, very damp arm of the European continent. And the Atlantic Ocean throws pretty much everything at us. And weather is often used as a topic of conversation to fill in gaps, to greet people you haven't seen for a while. So at one level, as I say, it's a terribly British start. But that's a cultural tendency that should be encouraged. If anything, talking about the weather will become a more important topic in the years ahead. Although I'm not sure, especially as socialists, that we can long remain very polite about the topic. And that's because the weather is becoming more and more extreme and is causing greater and greater human suffering. It's not like that today, we notice. It's more just slightly irritating drizzle. But we need to be quite direct from the outset on this. What's happening to our weather is a symptom of a pretty dark environmental problem. It's a direct product of climate change. So in this meeting, we're not going to spend any time debating whether climate change is occurring. We can mention the debate and look at the politics of the debate, but we're not going to be looking at the evidence for or against. It is happening. It's a very disingenuous argument that raises its head in the media with depressing regularity. It's often put forward as sort of balanced journalism. And what the claim is always is that scientists aren't sure that human beings are the cause of climate change. That's not true. In the 5th United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report that came out in May, that's IPCC for short, that report stated with 95% confidence that humans are the main cause of current global warming. Indeed, the report went on to state that 100% of the global warming over the past 60 years is human caused. And in a recent survey, 97% of 12,000 peer-reviewed scientific papers on climate change concluded that humanity was the cause of global warming. There's an overwhelming scientific consensus that climate change is happening and that human society is the cause. If you want to understand why scientific uncertainty has come to sit alongside in the media as being presented as balance, here's a nice quote. It's from the US Republican Party communications strategist called Frank Luntz, and it was leaked in 2002. Should the public come to believe that the scientific issues are settled, their views about global warming will change accordingly. Therefore, you need to continue to make the lack of scientific certainty a primary issue in the debate. So it means that there's a pretty straightforward interpretation available for us to understand what these voices of doubt are over climate change. There are no climate change skeptics, and there are no climate change deniers. These commentators, backed to the hilt as they are, usually with corporate sponsorship, are in fact the political opponents of climate change. Their position is one almost entirely of politics and very, very little scientific. Their emphasis on scientific uncertainty and even on the possible benefits of climate change are pretty heavily spin-doctored political strategies. The sole aim of which is to maintain or extend the fossil fuel corporate status quo. Because I've got that out of the system, sorry about that. And now we'll talk about the weather. We'll break the meeting down. We'll talk about the links between climate change and extreme weather, and then we'll talk about the context in which extreme weather is taking place. Climate change is being driven by the use of fossil fuels, and that's coal, oil, gas. It's also being driven by deforestation, It's also being driven by the changing albedo of the planet, and what that means is a reduction in whiteness, reflective white that comes from glaciers as they melt, for instance, is being reduced. All of these effects are causing climate change and global warming, and that's having a reinforcing effect by releasing methane from the permafrost, and we're also seeing methane being released from agriculture. There's a little bit of science here, so hold on to your hats. Fossil fuel releases carbon dioxide, and that's one of the so-called greenhouse gases. What carbon dioxide does is it traps energy and re-radiates it within the Earth's atmosphere. So what it does is it affects the energy balance across the surface of the Earth. It's causing an imbalance within the Earth's climate. There's a very good scientist called James Hansen who used to work for NASA, but now he spends most of his time being arrested around the world as a climate change activist. The best way he described it, he said that fossil fuel carbon dioxide release and build-up is like throwing a blanket on the bed. Okay, so you're adding a layer of insulation. And the problem with that is that many of the Earth's systems that absorb heat are being affected by that increased energy. So for instance, the Earth's oceans normally operate as a kind of heat sink, and what's happened from the most recent research is that the oceans themselves are warming up. So the top layers of the oceans are already becoming quite warm, and even down to the deep ocean, we're starting to see temperature increase. At the same time, we're seeing increasing temperatures on the Earth's glaciers and the ice caps, and the land surface itself is showing increasing temperature to the depths of tens of meters. So what's happening is that the entire Earth is warming, and it's warming because greenhouse gases are trapping extra energy in our system. According to Hansen, we're looking at a figure of around 0.6 of a watt per square meter. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot. It sounds like a very small amount if you're a square meter. But if you ramp that up globally, it's a figure that's about 20 times humanity's total energy use. And if you want a historic equivalent, it's the same as 400,000 Hiroshima atom bombs being let off every day, 365 days of the year. So it's quite a build-up of energy, excess energy in the system. Now all of that imbalance that we've seen is happening at the same time that we've seen the deepest solar minimum on record. So in other words, the actual amount of energy coming from the sun has been historically very low at the same time that we've seen this increase in temperature. What it illustrates is a very strong driver of climate change that carbon dioxide is. Our current level of carbon dioxide is 391 parts per million in the atmosphere, and we really need to be pushing it back down to 350 parts per million if we want to avoid global temperature increases higher than 2 degrees Celsius, which is seen as a kind of threshold by scientists, and a critical threshold. So that's the relationship between carbon dioxide and climate change, and as I say, it's a product of fossil fuels and industrialization, and it's affecting the energy balance of the Earth. Well, how does that affect the weather? What we'll see from climate change opposition groups is that they'll point at single floods or storms or heat waves as just weather. Those are just normal weather patterns. They don't prove anything about climate. But an American meteorologist recently put it, climate trains the boxer, but weather throws the punches. So in other words, we can't just say it's just weather and disconnect it from the climate and from climatic systems as a whole. There's a very close connection between climate and weather. And the energy imbalance that we're talking about is having an effect of disrupting climatic systems all over the world. If you want to understand it in a kind of simplistic way, it's a bit like taking a pan of cold water, putting it on a hob, and then turning the hob up, and then watching what happens to the water inside. You can see that increased energy starts to produce lots of flow within the water. Obviously, get your head out of the way before it goes to boiling. But ultimately, what you find is a dynamic changing system because of increased energy before it moves to a new state. So the kinds of weather patterns that we're talking about, we're familiar with from the news and from some of our own personal experience. So it's increased flooding, increased rainfall, periods of drought, periods even of higher snowfall. And the system that it's affecting is all to do with water. So as climate change forces the temperature up and there's more and more energy in the system, it's the water and water system at its extremes that becomes more and more influenced by climate change. A good example, I suppose, is glacier melts. 95% of the world's glaciers are retreating or shrinking. And there's also the issue of sea level rise as the oceans warm themselves and expand, but also as we see more and more ice fall into the oceans. So what we're looking at is a system of extreme weather that's a product of a changing climate. And there's a lot of strong geological evidence and paleoclimatic evidence that links carbon dioxide levels with temperature and with climate change. It's the speed with which it's occurring at the moment that's one of the major causes of concern. So things would be bad enough on the weather front if we were faced with climate change alone, but unfortunately for us, this climate change is taking place in a particular context. And the context, as we'll be aware, is capitalist society. The conditions and the severity of impact depend upon what scientists are calling exposure, and that's the elements of human society that are subject to climate change impact, and vulnerability, which is the degree of exposure. The impact of extreme weather and climate change doesn't fall evenly across human society or the Earth's ecology. There are some geographical reasons for some of those reasons. So, for instance, you're not likely to get hit by blizzards in sub-Saharan Africa. But fundamentally, your exposure and vulnerability will depend directly on where you find yourself relative to the forces of social and ecological devastation under capitalism. So let's give an example, a very recent one, that's I'm sure close to many people's hearts. Let's take flooding in the United Kingdom. So in the first instance, I'm just going to presume that the record high rainfall events of the last winter that we had in the UK are the result of climate change. Okay, so I'm just going to take that as a given. What we're going to look at instead is the context in which that rainfall was occurring. So in other words, why, when we had such extreme weather, was it even, why was it as bad as it was? It says when a raindrop hits the ground, it enters a very dynamic hydrological system. Okay, it enters a watershed or a catchment. And the speed of runoff of water within that is affected by the ecology within that system. So it's worth outlining just broadly what we're looking at. A river catchment is a network of streams and tributaries and small rivers that feed a big major river system like the Thames or the River Severn or the Humber. And it goes from the uplands all the way down to the estuaries. In the uplands, rainwater is very slowly filtered through hundreds of acres of peat moorland. Peat is 98% water. and it then filters into quite fast-flowing mountain streams, and then moves on into the lowlands. In the lowlands, rainfall soaks the ground and seeps through farmland, woodland, and a network of tributaries before it reaches the main river body. And then before reaching the estuaries and the sea, many of the large rivers will meander across extensive low-lying floodplains, like the Somerset levels that were flooded, or the Gwent levels, where I'm from, where seasonal flooding will deposit tons of silt across the landscape. Now, we've always exploited river catchments. We've done it for water, for fish, for farmland irrigation, for transportation, trade routes, canals, reservoirs, and so on, and at the other end of our society, for sewage and waste disposal. Now, given our reliance on those functioning watersheds, you'd think that our use of river catchments was being rationally controlled and carefully ecologically managed. But it's not. Quite the opposite. Every element of our rivers' watersheds are under attack from what is effectively capitalism. At the top end of our catchments, peat bogs and moorlands have been devastated after decades of inappropriate forestry and overgrazing by sheep, increased development pressure from roads and industry, and there are plans to dismantle planning permission rules as we speak on common land, which will just make that worse. So the water carrying capacity and cleansing power of the uplands is already declining and has been declining quite rapidly, even before climate change is taken into consideration. So there's a faster runoff of water from the uplands, so that's the first thing to note. Across the lowland landscape, capitalist farming has generated a crisis of soil conservation. So a lot of water flow and a lot of what affects flooding is all about the soil. And as we all know, or if we don't, we can find out, capitalism's relationship to the soil is absolutely appallingly exploited. Since the end of the war, farmers in the UK have intensified their agriculture. So they've ripped out hedgerows, they've increased the land drains, they've increased livestock numbers and put more and more land under monoculture. That's just single crop. And more recently, they've also included maize silage production, which leaves fields of bare soil through the wettest winter months. So what you would have seen out across the catchment and lowland areas when we had all that heavy rain is just earth running down the fields, into the roads, into the drains. So soil management and husbandry has really become terrible in the last few decades because of agricultural intensification. And it entails massive disruption and destruction of the biological processes that actually create soils. So earthworms, for instance, it's quite not uncommon now to hear from farmers in lowland areas of Britain that when they plough, where they used to have flocks of seagulls that followed them to pick up the earthworms and stuff, they don't get anything anymore. And there are samples that have been taking place where there's no earthworms in the soil whatsoever. So it's a system, a dynamic ecological system that has been systematically dismantled and is under great pressure and being destroyed through capitalist agriculture. What's happened when you do that is when you lose the dynamism of the soil is that the water table rises and you get a very hard pan of soil, subsoil. So when rain falls, instead of soaking through the ground through a dynamic soil, it sits on the top and it flashes off. Okay, so that's what we're seeing. From the uplands, increased speed of runoff. From the lowlands, through soil compaction, even faster runoff. Okay, so not only have we got extreme rainfall, but we've created the conditions under capitalist agriculture where those events are magnified. And that's what I mean about the context in which climate change is occurring and extreme weather events occur. It would be bad enough if it was climate change alone. But because capitalism is inherently anti-ecological in that respect, and is breaking things down and dismantling ecological systems, sometimes it's quite hard to even tell what the impact of climate change is. When we get into our towns and cities, what we're finding as well is that housing estates are being built in floodplains. This is being done so that more profit can be made. Nice flat areas, sell the houses on to to homeowners or to other people, and they're the ones that pick up the cost through either massive insurance or through having their homes flooded. So the effect of property investment is subtle, but it's real, and it's seen important areas of floodplains going under tarmac. And as more and more of the floodplains become concrete and tarmac, it's likely to worsen. So if we look back on the extreme rainfall events that we saw in the UK, and we take those things into consideration, what we can see is that rain was falling into a traumatized river catchment in the first place. So it's not just not falling into a natural system, it's falling into a system that's being traumatized by capitalism. And we can understand as well why it will very quickly translate into droughts, for instance. So one of the things that strikes people as weird is you have flooding, and then a few months later you might have a drought. Well, the reasons for that is that the soil has been so compacted and so destroyed that none of the water has been stored. It's all flying straight off and going out into the sea. So I just wanted to give you those examples for the flooding events in the UK as an illustration of the fact that we're not just looking at extreme weather from climate change, we're looking at the way that extreme weather coincides, if you like, with the destructive ecological patterns that capitalism produces. So our system is in crisis in two directions. And if it's true of flooding in the UK, if you look around the world and look at some of the other issues around climate change, it's very similar. You know, you've got disruption of land practices affecting and worsening climate change trends. So the forest and the bushfires in Australia, for instance, are in part facilitated by the lack of controlled burning that was once carried out by Aboriginals. In Indonesia, temperature increases and forest fires are made far, far worse by massive palm oil plantations, which are extremely foul. In Egypt and southern Spain, aquifers in the ground are being drained for luxury holiday accommodation and golf courses. And the droughts and desertification in sub-Saharan Africa are being worsened by the development of high-input cash crops, which are all strongly associated with privatization of land and land grabbing by corporations. Flooding in Bangladesh is worsened by land inequality, and tropical deforestation reduces carbon dioxide uptake within ecosystems, as well as releasing it through forest fires. Out in respect of sea level rise, tropical storms are worsened by the loss and the damage to coral reefs and through overfishing. So the point, I guess, to contextualize in extreme weather and climate change in an ecological sense is that capitalism's ecological expression, which is dominated and shaped by profit and commodity markets, is so inherently destructive and unsettled that it makes it hard sometimes to decipher what is and what isn't climate change. The overwhelming example is one that I work on in my professional life as a conservationist, which is species loss. There's a very, very strong geological association between climate change and species extinction. And current climate change is projected to drive a quarter of the Earth's species into extinction by 2050. But to be honest, at the current rates of ecological destruction, many of those species would be lucky to make it that far anyway. So that's the kind of ecological context. And what's the social context? Well, what we know is that climate change enhances what we could describe as environmental inequality. And what do we mean by that is inequalities across existing groups like class, gender and race, in terms of both their access to nature, water and food, or their shelter from nature, shelter from weather and so on. The 2009 Human Impact Report claims that 300,000 people a year are already dying from the effects of climate change, and a further 4 billion are vulnerable to the effects of things like drought and water shortages, floods and other extreme weather, crop failures and food insecurity. And there are projections that another 50 million will be facing hunger by 2050. And what we know about the social impact of climate change is that it falls disproportionately on poor people and on working class people. There's some examples. So there's pensioners who end up being left on their own during a heat wave in industrialized countries. The workers who spend most of their days outdoors who are affected more and more by the weather and extreme weather. The slum dwellers in the mega cities of the developing world. And those are sort of vulnerable groups that are hit disproportionately by climate change. The overwhelming example, if we want to see what happens in a sudden, severe or extreme weather event, comes from Hurricane Katrina. Hurricane Katrina victims faced difficult living conditions even before the storm arrived. Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama are the first, second, and eighth poorest states in the US. 5.8 million people who lived in the areas were struck hardest by the hurricane. More than 1 million lived in poverty prior to the hurricane's onset. The reason why so many poor people suffered through Hurricane Katrina is that they were so poor that they didn't have vehicles. So if in Mississippi and those areas, having a vehicle is a measure of your wealth, and having a vehicle in the face of Hurricane Katrina was your route out of the city. 54% of poor households in New Orleans did not have a car or a truck or a van in 2000 when Katrina struck. Among the elderly, the proportion was higher. 65% of poor elderly households in New Orleans did not have a vehicle, making it difficult, if not impossible, to escape the storm. There's a race element, unsurprisingly, involved as well. African Americans living in New Orleans were especially likely to be without a vehicle before the hurricane struck. More than 1 in 3 black households in New Orleans and nearly 3 in 5 poor black households lack a vehicle. Among the white non-Hispanic households in New Orleans, 15% lacked a vehicle. So the equation for Hurricane Katrina ran along the lines of no money, no car, no escape. So it's a very good illustration, and that illustration repeats itself in other extreme weather events of the sort of class breakdown of the impact of climate change. Well, you all look quite miserable now. What we've tried to do, I guess, is just to say, look, climate change is very bad. Very bad. It's a real geological force that we're unleashing, and it's come from the history of capitalist industrialization. It goes back to the 1750s in the Industrial Revolution. There's a very direct link between capitalism and climate change, not least because of now the large corporations who are mixed up burning fossil fuels. But it's not the sole problem that we face in that area. The effect of capitalism on ecology is also very, very disruptive, making these instances worse. And then we're faced with the socio-economic makeup of the society that we're in, and what we find, unsurprisingly, is the poor and the vulnerable who are worst affected by the climate. So it's a very serious issue, and when we are talking about the weather, one of the things we should be doing is highlighting the fact that under climate change, what we're seeing is the evidence of capitalism as a completely unsustainable system. It's short term, it's based on international competition between blocks of capital and individual members of the bourgeoisie, however we want to frame it. If you think about the way that we need to solve climate change, we can run a few sort of health checks of capitalism. To get out of climate change, we'll need the following, and we'll think of a test for capitalism against this. We need coordinated planning and democratic oversight. On that, capitalism fails. We need to work with nature to look at the systems that we've got in front of us, to see where we can utilize existing ecology to either buffer or deflect the impact of climate change, not against nature. Again, on that one, capitalism fails. We need to invest in meaningful innovation for energy, both in terms of its production and its use. And we also need to look very seriously at how we can reduce the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, either through sequestration or through some major geological engineering. And again, because that's not very profitable, it's an area in which capitalism fails. We also need a managed transition from workers, for workers, in carbon-intensive industries. We know that there are loads and loads of people who are employed and whose livelihoods depend on carbon-intensive industries, whether that's extraction in coal or whether it's in other areas like production of cars and so on. Obviously, we wouldn't advocate getting rid of those industries and sacking all those people overnight. There needs to be a proper managed transition for those. And again, it's something that capitalism fails on. The good news is, that this understanding of this problem is very, very widely held. Lots and lots of people all over the world are now aware of climate change, not just because they feel it in their own lives, because they have deep concerns and a growing understanding of the problems. Much more mature understanding than most of the politicians and quite a lot of journalists. And there are some fantastic campaigns. There's the campaign against climate change in this country. There's a trade union element to that, which is a very, very important area where socialists can contribute. There's campaigns like 1 million jobs for climate. So there's lots of things going on. But one of the elements that we need to remember is that as socialists, we can bring a sharpening and a contextualization of the climate change arguments. So we can show people how it isn't just a single issue environmental problem, it's something that's wider, it's more societal, and it's deeply rooted in the way that capitalist society operates normally. So we have to get rid of it to save the planet and ourselves.
Two questions. One is, as revolutionary socialists, how do we steer through the contradictions between our knowledge that it's only the working class really that's the cohesive grouping in society that has both the interests and the power to defend against climate change, deal with climate change, and the knowledge or the understanding that as austerity bites, it's harder and harder for working class families for us to be that concerned about climate change. It's not at the forefront of our union meetings, etc. So the power is there, the interest is lesser, I think, than it was a few years ago. And the second one's a little bit obscure, so apologies if you don't know anything about this, but Trident, one of the arguments in Scotland for independence is based on the economic arguments that Scottish society could be quite well off and mineral rich, and we live in a very wet and windy country in Scotland, so there shouldn't be a problem in terms of fuel. But Trident is, apparently there's more oil in the west coast of Scotland than there has been exploited in the east coast, and the only reason it hasn't been exploited is because it would cut across the shipping lanes that are needed to keep totally useless Trident nuclear missiles, etc. So would it be opportunistic to argue that point, or just forget about it because it would lead to more climate change if we did utilise the oil in Scotland?
Yes, just to update on what Ian said about the Million Climate Jobs campaign. The third edition is going to be coming out in September, quite updated, and the argument around the Million Climate Jobs is we've got a problem about unemployment and we've got a problem about climate change. So what we need to do is develop industries which lessen the CO2 in the atmosphere and actually provide good employment. So we're talking about building homes, more public transport, etc., etc., etc. And that's kind of detailed and costed and shows what industries could be used and so on. To actually emphasise up to the 2015 election campaign, they're launching this year a Time to Act campaign, which is time to act on climate change for a future that doesn't cost the earth, and that's going to be kind of a major demonstration just before the 2015 election. Because I think, I'd say disagree with the previous speaker, because 9 years ago, trade unions didn't have a policy on climate change. The first ones came in about 8 years ago. Now every trade union's got a policy on climate change, and the issue now is how do we turn the abstract ideas into concrete reality, which means you have to work out specific areas. So for example, in Unite, how do you, if people are not going to work on aircraft or whatever, what else can they do? An obvious one to me would be in the, where they're closing down dockyards, is to argue for their conversion to the vehicles, etc., around wind turbines and so on. But what I think is important, I used to think, oh, it's a technical problem, it's going to be so complicated. But actually, all the technical solutions, by and large, are done. You can go on many places on the web where reputable scientists say this, how you can deal with this problem and so on. It's not a technical problem, it's a political problem. And as socialists, we ought to be able to have a major input into that.
Mark, I'm a physical geographer from the Netherlands. As you see, we're trying to cope with climate change as well. I expect the weather to become more Scottish during the coming year, so I'm ahead of them, I guess. 15 years ago, when I was working at the university, the question of climate change was still being debated in a very open way. And in the past 15 years, 95% of scientists have become convinced that the current climate change is being caused by man, fossil fuels, and what have you. 95%. Why not 100? This is an interesting question. I'll come back to that. There are a number of philosophical problems associated with proving climate change. Adrian commented on that already. There's a problem in terms of we have events, bad winters, high temperatures, and so on, and it takes a bit of trickery to translate that into a pattern. But at some point, and I think that's happened over the past 15 years, it has become clear that actually there is a pattern. The pattern is undeniable, at least for most of us. There are two other things that could confuse you. The first thing has already been commented on. We have the problem of thresholds. So in the beginning, the warming of the oceans was very slow. It's actually accelerating because the polar caps are melting. And this is where you get the way that the different components of the climate system are connected. Because the atmosphere heatens, the polar caps are melting, and this actually decreases what they call North Atlantic Deepwater Formation, which is a very complicated term, but it means that the ocean is actually moving, like the atmosphere, in a circular way. I'm talking about vertically. This movement is decreasing due to the melting of the polar caps and what have you. So it means that actually we are witnessing a decrease of the buffer that the climate change, that the climate system has always represented. And then you can get a second aspect, which is the question of feedbacks. Normally the climate system is in balance because when one thing goes wrong, you can say the other thing will compensate for that. Now you get something different. Because of the combined heating up of atmosphere and oceans, for instance, you get the melting of the tundras. I've missed them in the talk. That may have been that I didn't follow the whole talk. But this is a very very worrying development, because if the tundras melt and they don't find a way to stabilize them, huge amounts of methane will come into the atmosphere, and there's already been proven that this is currently happening, which will actually accelerate climate change to a degree not known to any scientist in the world at all. So it's not like an easy story to have. We should be really, actually, totally worried about this. But the good thing is, the scientists, 95% are on our side, and the public experience is also that climate change, a hurricane in New York, what the hell? I mean, so this connects to common sense. 95%, why? Because our world economy, 9 out of 10 corporations, the biggest ones, are connected to oil industry. They are oil industry, or they build cars for oil industry. We're talking about Shell, BP, Exxon, General Motors, Ford, what have you. Bloody capitalism runs on fossil fuel. This is the problem. You can't get around crushing this system, because simply the system is intrinsically ruining climate and every other aspect that's already been mentioned. 5% of scientists have been proven to be connected to this industry. The scientists currently disputing, then I'll finish on this, actually have been proven to be, for instance in the US, in the same sort of think tanks as the pro-smoking lobby. Well, there's been a nice article in the ISJ a few years ago on that. I will refer you to that. We know how scientific they are, and I hope well, this gives you a bit of a clue what we're fighting against. Thank you.
Yeah, it's sort of building actually on what the last speaker talked about, because actually scientists do agree that we need to prevent temperatures rising by 2 degrees. Now that can seem very small, but I actually think the talk gave very clear the impact of a 2-degree change. There are already changes happening, that's what we've talked about, but the 2 degrees is when actually it hits a tipping point and you hit runaway climate change in a way that's being described. The question is, it's actually very simple. We could stop that happening. The starting point's got to be fossil fuels have to stay in the ground. Coal, oil and gas, we have to stop using them. The question comes then, what do you replace them with? Again, there are solutions. Renewable energies. I'm not just talking here about a few wind turbines. We'd have to talk about wind turbines offshore, en masse, massive solar panels in the deserts, reflect, in that way. We have the technology. This could be used in that way. Combined at the same time as energy efficiency. A massive amount of our energy is wasted from where it's generated through the national grid, through outdated way it goes through the grids. Actually think about integrated transport. There's a whole number of things we could do. The question is, why doesn't this happen? And I think the speaker just previous said this very clearly. There is massive sunken investments in capitalism in the fossil fuel industry. This is what the whole development of capitalism was fueled with first coal and then oil. So of course it's not just about our actual energy use now, it is the car, the road, all those lobbies absolutely don't want to break from the fossil fuel industry. And then the solutions they do propose, which they give a green gloss, one of them being fracking, is somehow this is now greener, this will help us do it, except actually fracking is about getting even dirtier oil and gas from the ground in a way that actually can leak even more methane, which is another climate change gas into it, and actually in the process contribute further to our environment when you think about the poisoning of water, the earthquakes, all those things that are going on. And that's both, so you've got the investments there and the companies to do with the fossil fuel industry, and no one willing to break from the mechanisms of the market to intervene and deal with this, but going with these solutions actually, a number of companies are getting very well off from the fracking. I want to finish on what do we do? Because you see, I think fracking has become a little bit of a focus, for example, in Britain, that's brought together different people. The Tories want to push ahead. They actually want to change the law that even if you've got private land, you can go and frack under it, in that way. But there's been brilliant campaigns. You think about in Manchester at Barton Moss, people camped out there, but actually it wasn't just the environmental movement, they actually linked up with trade unions around the area. They held a massive march throughout Manchester that drew people in. This is the sort of thing we have to do to challenge these interests. And you think about it further, actually campaigns that are about transport, whether it's tube workers on strike or the Barnsley Freedom Riders who are currently fighting to keep the free passes for old age pensioners and disabled people there, they are about defending transport. This is also about the environment. Housing campaigns, what sort of insulation do we need? And our job is to link up, if you like, and bring into the campaigns these demands alongside them. So you think today, 1.4 million workers on strike for public services, fantastic. These are the very people who are at the heart of trying to provide transport, housing and all the things we need that could be done differently. And we have to bring in the environmental things with the power to challenge those vested interests and the whole system as well.
Hi, I'm from the Netherlands, and I was wondering more, I wanted to learn more about the climate job campaign, and maybe someone could tell me more about it. But I have one question about it. What do we want with it? Because I've been in a climate job in the Netherlands, and of course a job within capitalism, and I'm a bit skeptical about the possibilities. Because what I've seen is that I sold solar panels there, but originally I just graduated in art history, so you think, what the hell? But what the company did was actually really cheaply hire students or postgraduates within a system of already placed technology in order to cheaply build solar panels on rooftops and sell them to people. Well, after doing this for a couple of months, I don't believe in it anymore. And apart from the exploitative fact, I don't see this as a solution to the climate change problem. I see it more as, this kind of jobs more as a way to make the myth stronger that we can, by consumerism, solve the problem. So I was wondering, what kind of climate jobs do we want, and is it even possible within capitalism? Because this is not my experience.
Yeah, you said something about high impact plants being used in sub-Saharan Africa. I was just wondering if you could give us some examples.
One of my friends, he's from Surrey University, he's a civil engineer, and he's an earthquake expert. Just today in the morning, he shared with me that the new Indian government has proposed to make some dozens of airports, new airports, in different parts of India. So I argued with him that yes, it may create some jobs, but in the long run, it will have to have flights, new flights, and the structures which will be built for the new airports that will create disruption in Indian climate. And we have already seen how in Uttarakhand unplanned building structures were devastated by a huge earthquake and a huge storm. So on one hand, general people, common people, they are saying that these kind of things will create jobs. But I'm asking the panel, means it is not the solution for jobs. It will create more devastation. It will create more earthquakes or whatever climatic disruptions can happen. Thank you.
It's something that came to my mind when I saw a video of the Vice President of America, that one who was in the campaign with the warmonger, you know, and lost. And he made a video about climate change. And I saw the video, what the DVD, like 3 weeks ago. and he looked very radical. What do we do? Which position do we have as revolutionaries, with these people who are social democrats and they fight for climate change, but they don't want to change the world? What kind of relationship we build with them? And especially that people that use the mass media all around the world. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a question. It was argued earlier that corporations have obviously an investment interest in fossil fuels. Could you not argue that they would have an investment interest in renewables? And is the problem therefore not about whether they've got an investment in fossil fuels, but it's the fact that the rate of profit that you get from a turbine is less than the rate of profit you get from an oil well? So I'm asking, is it they just happen to be committed to fossil fuels and they don't want to change, or is it to do with rate of profit? And if it's a lower rate of profit, then how do we argue, that this is the thing to do? You'd actually, I think it comes back to your argument, you have to smash capitalism so it's not the rate of profit that decides what you do, but human interest.
Okay, so I've had a couple more people.
Yeah, one of the things is the engineering aspect of renewables. And the big argument is that renewables are not reliable. The wind doesn't blow all the time, the sun doesn't shine all the time. But the solution is very easy. You just store the energy. The problem is you can't, under capitalism, encourage people to invest in storage. Storage is simple, it's very easy to do, but it requires capital to do it. That's all.
Okay, I'm living in Poland at the moment, and I think if anybody knows anything about Poland, that's that the vast majority of the energy comes from coal. And at the same time, there's been recently a fight in the coal industry to preserve jobs. Now, as a socialist, then the question is obvious. What do you say? Oh, we don't want the coal industry. Do we support the fight for jobs? Now, of course, I think that the only way to approach it is what you said during the talk, that really if there's any issue where you can't see that issue being resolved under capitalism, that's climate change. And what you need is for the side that can fight capitalism to be as strong as possible. So if the coal miners are threatened with job loss, we have to support 100% their fight to preserve their jobs, because the stronger the coal miners get, the stronger the fight against capitalism will become. On another issue, there's been a wave of trials for fracking in Poland, not trials, legal trials, but testing and drilling for gas, and different multinationals have become involved in it. And there has been a success. There's been a number of local campaigns, which is a very interesting development, where people don't want to have the fracking in their local area. And we've just heard this week that Chevron has withdrawn from an area in Poland because of a campaign against fracking. So I think for socialists, what we have to do is to link the workers' fight with local campaigns and link it into an overall picture of a fight against capitalism.
It's an interesting question. Capitalists would be interested in renewables, yes, but I think we're dealing with the same paradox as capitalists being interested in healthy workers, but at the same time they need to exploit them. So this is the paradoxical character of capitalism undermining itself. This is what we have to deal with. So the basic reason, I think, why you can see historically capitalists are not interested in renewables. When I think it was a big oil corporation got control of public transport in one of the big American cities, I guess it was Chicago, but I can be wrong, they smashed up the rails and sold cars. At this moment, they are raising taxes and payments for people who own solar panels. We can only explain that by the fact that they are determined to grasp to the current way of production. Shell alone has thousands of petrol stations throughout Europe. The advantage of oil and similar substances is that you can sell it as an item. Renewables, you cannot sell them as an item because everybody has them. The problem is if we don't have the technology to access it. This is the problem. It's a totally different way of providing in your own energy, and they are not willing to adapt to that. This is why we have to link that indeed to a fight. I would find it very interesting if people that would come back would indicate successes in the fights we have fought. I think that the campaigns around fracking are very interesting, and the comments about that. But I think in general it will be very difficult to mobilize a fight against climate change. It will be rather fighting against the results of climate change, rising food prices, floods, and what have you. And I think that we have to ask ourselves how we're going to frame that and try to make it clear to larger numbers of people that really this is a structural problem and the system has to go.
I'm going to bring Ian back to sum up and to answer some of the questions that you've asked. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, a lot of questions. I'll do my best. There seem to be just general themes, and some of it is about, I guess, as socialists, what strategies and tactics we use in the area of climate change. That seems to be one of the themes. And I think the first thing to do is to talk about the role of workers and the working class. It's absolutely vital that we inject within environmental debates the issue of class. Because what we understand very clearly is that capitalists exploit workers and the planet. They do it in unison. They don't separate it out. They don't have those sorts of things. But what they quite often do is put an argument in front of people that says it's jobs versus the environment. And you've seen that more and more, especially under austerity. You know, we have to build on, we have to deforest this, is to create jobs. And jobs is just a euphemism for profit in that. Once we have that understanding and we use that in arguments with environmentalists, I think it'll help. Why it becomes important is that when we're faced with difficult situations like coal miners, for instance, we absolutely must be on the side of coal miners. We must be on the side of organised working class, because we know that that's where the power lies against the capitalists and against the capitalist system. But what we can do when working with coal miners is to interact with them about the industry that they're part of, because they're working in that industry. They don't own it. They perhaps should have more control over it, but they have a very mature understanding, I suspect, as a lot of working class people do, that we only have one Earth and that if we destroy it, we won't get another. So, you know, you can have those conversations with workers, and it highlights the importance of campaigns like the 1 million climate jobs. Because although, yes, it's true, alternative technology under capitalism is it's marginalized, it's not invested in, it's written off all the time as being, well, that's not going to make a difference, the solar panel here or whatever. But it's worth remembering what Marx said. The seeds of future society are existent, are present in the one we have. I'm sorry, that's a terrible paraphrasing, but you know what I mean. If we're looking for examples, if we're looking for hope, it's the society that we're in that we find those examples, whether that's working class organisation or whether it's alternative energy. And what we know is that because capitalism and because climate change and fossil fuels are so wrapped up with the ruling class and with corporations and everything else, they very deliberately don't want to invest in alternative energy. They have very little interest in that. In fact, their reaction to the retreating ice of the Arctic is not to say, oh my God, this is terrible, is to say, how quickly can we get in there and exploit the oil that's being exposed on the seabed as the ice retreats. It's like throwing petrol on a fire. So that's, we know what their reaction is. But if we're good within our campaigns, and we say to people, well, look, first of all, there's work to be had in making restoration, historic restoration to the climate and the environment, and we can create jobs and create a meaningful green economy, then we've got arguments that we can use within our debates with working class people who are just struggling against the system. I've got some specifics. Sub-Saharan Africa and high input plants, crops. Crops. So I mean, basically, that if you look at what's happening in places like Ethiopia, especially at the minute, you're getting traditional agricultural systems being replaced. Basically, corporations are being given land or are just grabbing it, and they're displacing people, and they replace the crops that were grown there that were perhaps more sensitive to the local climate with crops that are destined for Western markets. So things like peas or potatoes, those sorts of things. Now, they're, in the first instance, they're not always the best things to be growing in those areas anyway, because that's not where they came from. But they do also depend on massive inputs. And cash crops involve a lot of water, a lot of fertilizers, and a lot of pesticides. And so they hammer everything, and they hammer the soil more especially. So they're creating another soil crisis for us through that. I think the thing to say in conclusion is that the potential for sorting out climate change is very real, very, very real. If just some of the alternative energy things that we see in front of us could be invested in seriously, could be widened, a lot of the problems that we face in terms of reducing carbon dioxide and getting rid of fossil fuel use could be solved, but there's a lid on it. There's a lid on it, and the lid is because of the vested interests that are involved in squashing, first of all, our awareness of climate change through climate change denial, but also squashing our investment in those things. So I can't emphasize enough the importance and the opportunities that are available to us as socialists within the environmental debate at the minute. They're very, very real. Environmentalists are becoming quite depressed about the situation that they're faced with. And it's partly because they're not thinking of strategies that can link their campaigns with the conditions of working people and austerity and those sorts of things. So there's some really good arguments to be made out there, comrades, and some really sharp interventions to be made that will generalize and explain to people why there are very strong connections between things like climate change and the day-to-day struggle that they face under austerity and those types of things. And it does all go back to the same thing. It's a system that can't be reformed in the face of the power that the ruling class have over us in this area. So it has to go. There is no alternative.